So as you know, we now hand over to Miguel Vatter, Professor of Politics at the School of Social Sciences in the University of South Wales. Miguel has a frightening array of research interests, but he's the author, as we know, of Between Form and Event, Machiavelli's Theory of Political Freedom, as well as, of course, now in the bookstores, Machiavelli's Prince, A Reader's Guide, and he's going to be the author of the forthcoming The Republic of the Living. Today, he's going to be talking to us about Towards a Republican Conception of Divine Providence, a new reading of chapter 26.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Filippo Del Lucchese and the other organizers for inviting me. So, I don't know about a new reading, maybe that's too ambitious, but in this paper I'm concerned with the central political significance of the question of God, Dio, in Machiavelli's discourse. Traditionally, that is in the secondary literature, this conjunction of God and politics in Machiavelli has been explained in terms of an instrumental conception of religion associated with the Roman idea of a civil religion, theologia civilis. But does this hypothesis, that is, of the civil religion, exhaust the role of God in Machiavelli's political thought? Could Machiavelli also be employing a non-instrumental understanding of religion that explains why some parts of his political theory make sense in light of certain additional theological premises? In this case, one has left behind the hypothesis of civil religion and moved on to ask about Machiavelli's political theology. In the debate, if you wish, I can explain the difference between civil religion and political theology. I will not. It will be evident later. The relatively new claim that Machiavelli is not merely recovering an ancient or Roman conception of religion as instrument of political rule, but is putting forth a political theology of his own, has recently been made by Viroli in Machiavelli's God. According to Viroli, Machiavelli was neither an atheist nor a pagan. Quote, Machiavelli's God is the God of Florentine Republican Christianity. Now, the first principle of this Florentine political theology, according to Viroli, is, quote, that a true Christian is a good citizen who serves the common good and liberty in order to implement the divine plan on earth. God participates in human history, created men in his own image, and wishes them to become like him with their virtue, working to make the earthly city comparable to the heavenly city, end quote. Now, Viroli argues that thinkers as diverse as Thomas of Aquinas, Ficino, Savonarola, Leonardo Bruno, Jesus of Rome, Matteo Palmieri, all advocate one and the same Republican Christianity. Now, this seems to me really ridiculous, and I won't talk about it too much. But I do wish to talk about something important, which is, Viroli does raise the fundamental question, he raises the question, of what conception of divine glory and divine nature Machiavelli could have held that would serve as a foundation for his new way of understanding republicanism and love of country. Now, it is clear for me that for Machiavelli, the real problem of God's role in politics only emerges once the belief in God or gods is posed directly in relation to the most ferocious, violent, and pitiless aspect of politics, as illustrated by Roman historians and by a sensible reading of the Hebrew Bible. So in order to really pose the question, who is Machiavelli's God, one would have to find a conception of God which has a divine nature such that when human beings imitate this nature, they give rise to ferocious political actions, and furthermore, that imitating God's nature in this ferocious way makes of the citizen a saint, in the Hebrew sense of the term. That is, by obeying extraordinary commands, Discourses 3:22, you become saintly. That's what's at stake. So one place where I find such a God in Machiavelli's writings is in the famous concluding chapter 26 of The Prince. Now, in my discussion, I shall refer my arguments to Mario Martelli's famous reading of the providential logic of this chapter, which in my opinion remains by far the most important interpretation of this chapter in the secondary literature. Although in the legendary back and forth exchange between Sasso and Martelli, I usually find myself agreeing more with Sasso, I must admit that on the chapter 26, Martelli seems to be infinitely superior. Still, I will propose an alternative reading to Martelli's of what providence means. Now, Machiavelli ended chapter 25 with a shocking claim that Fortuna is a woman and she likes to be beaten, possibly by an audacious and younger man. So Fortuna grants her favors more easily to those leaders who arm and fight with their people. We've heard this repeated times in this conference. But what about God? The title of the last chapter, an exhortation to seize Italy and to set her free from the barbarians, actually lays at the feet of the addressee of the prince, whoever this may be, literal and extra-literal, the task that Pope Julius II, known for his audacity, half-heartedly attempted and failed to accomplish. Now, the new civil prince, theorized in Machiavelli's own opuscolo, must dare what the papacy never really wanted to do, namely, unite Italy and make it unconquerable by foreign armies. Since the papacy, according to Machiavelli, depended for its temporal power on keeping Italy divided and at the mercy of the barbarians, Machiavelli's project also entails, in some level, bringing about the end of the temporal power of the Catholic Church. As if this were not audacious enough, and as Martelli points out, in order to give birth to a new nation-state, the civil prince would also have to grab absolute power and therefore give up his civil status. So Machiavelli closes chapter 25 by praising audacity for good reason. He's preparing the reader, whoever this addressee is, for an extremely audacious proposition of chapter 26. Given this context, it makes now perfect sense for Machiavelli at the end of The Prince to ask whether God, not just Fortuna, would favor such audacity. To ask, in other words, would God be willing to see a new popular sovereign take the place of the Pope as his representative on earth? Now, once Machiavelli answers these questions in the affirmative, which had never really been asked nor answered in such blunt terms, all the great modern political thinkers rush through the opening. Hobbes, Spinoza, Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, Marx, all of them, without exception, in one form or another, had no qualms asserting that the march of popular sovereignty in history, the revolutionary conquest of power by the people, is of course the actual plan of divine providence and the meaning of history. So my hypothesis is that this God of chapter 26 is definitely not to be found in the Republican Christianity reconstructed by Viroli, but rather, and this is the hypothesis, in another tradition of understanding divine providence, which is basically the Arabic and Jewish medieval understandings of prophets and revealed religion, which Viroli omits. It is not within the Respublica Cristiana that Machiavelli could find inspiration for his own dream of an Italian state that would stand independent from the Roman Catholic Church. Much more promising, instead, was the fertile terrain of medieval Arabic and Jewish political thought concerned with the question of what kind of churchless republic God wishes to establish through his philosophers, prophets, and kings. The question of God's role in politics crops up repeatedly in Machiavelli's works, but it reaches its climax, or one of them, in the last chapter of The Prince. For Martelli, as you know, this chapter basically contains two riddles. One, why does Machiavelli appeal to divine providence in order to bolster the ambitions of the new prince when he advances irreligious thesis throughout the rest of the book? Does he seriously mean what he says in the chapter about providence, or is it mere rhetorical or ironical flourish? Does the introduction of divine providence not ruin his famous Lucretian naturalism with respect to history? Second riddle has to do with the monarchic persona, the absolute power, taken by the new prince who is to unify Italy. How does this stand with Machiavelli's adoption throughout most of his writings of a staunchly pro-popular government stance, or at least a civil prince? Does Machiavelli return to the old figures of divine providence and monarchy at the very end of a book that called both of these into question? Or is there a completely different way of understanding the unexpected appearance of the figure of the divine monarch at the end of The Prince? Those are the two riddles I pretend to answer now. Let's begin by thinking about the way God favors some politics over others. This is the traditional question of special providence. This is, of course, not a new question for Machiavelli, since in the Discourses on Livy, he discusses at length the essential role played by religion and deities in the Roman Republic, thereby inaugurating the modern treatment of civil religion. But Savonarola's preaching, as Fabio was talking about it, also brought to life for the Florentines another republic that received the favor of the true God, namely the Republic of the Hebrews. Here were two perfect case studies of God's role in politics that Machiavelli could oppose to the way in which the Christian church conceived and taught for more than 1,000 years God's supposed disdain for politics? Is there a way to reconceive divine providence in such a way that it fits the way in which these two republics conceived of God? Now, Machiavelli's theory of chance in chapter 25 is characterized by a thoroughgoing Lucretian, naturalist, even proto-evolutionary perspective on human history. But now in chapter 26, he raises his sights from the plane of man's natural history to the plane of his sacred history. I will not repeat the quotations, they're so evident. For example, beyond this, see here the extraordinary things without precedent conducted by God, the sea is open, blah, blah, blah. Is it possible to reconcile, then, an evolutionary, radically naturalistic approach to human natural history with such a providential picture in chapter 26? So that's, again, what I will attempt to do. In chapter 6, as Warren has explained, the opposition Machiavelli posits between the armed prophet Moses and the unarmed prophet Savonarola is, in my opinion, clearly based on a distinction between the Jewish and the Christian conceptions of divine providence, which on many counts diverge from each other. If this is so, then what I'm trying to put forward is, why don't we apply this distinction between Christian and Jewish conceptions of providence also to a reading of chapter 26? Let's see what happens if by providence we don't understand in chapter 26 a Christian but a Jewish conception. Late medieval political thought was not only a Christian affair. Outside of the Christian mainstream, sometimes against the current, medieval Arabic and Jewish thinkers asked the question again, what kind of republic does God wish to establish through his prophets? From Spain and Portugal through France and Germany, this political thought trickles down to Italian humanist culture by way of several possible conduits, some known, but many of them needing still to be discovered. Certainly the Latin Averroism of Latini, Dante, Marsilio plays a significant role. So too does the Hebraic Thomism of Ptolemy, of Luca and Savonarola, not to mention the syncretism of Platonic theology and Kabbalah in Pico and Ficino. And finally, directly through the available translations into Latin of Alfarabi, Averroes, Maimonides. Closer still to Machiavelli's Florence, the work and presence of Johann Alemanno and Isaac Abravanel in Venice. It's unclear, obviously, and this is not the point, of how many of these sources Machiavelli could have reached Machiavelli. That's a different argument which I'm not going to discuss now. Now, a fundamental conduit for these Arabic and Jewish ideas of divine providence is that the most important one is definitely the reception of Moses Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed in the culture of the Italian Renaissance, as well as the works of Alemanno and Abravanel. Now, in the guide, Maimonides explains the double nature of God, who is composed of an essence that remains completely unknowable to human beings and of an existence that consists in 13 divine attributes of his glory. These attributes are all ethico-political in character. They are therefore the object of human imitation, and they ground the possibility that the ethico-political actions of human beings may fashion them into a likeness of God and thus make them saintly. So that's where we find an idea of imitating God that is thoroughly political, not in the Christian tradition. Maimonides furthermore distinguishes between the pagan conception of religious political laws, which he calls nomoi, and the Jewish Arabic conception of divinely revealed law. Since he wrote in Arabic, he calls it Sharia. His awareness of a distinction between civil religion and political theology, between nomoi and Sharia, speaks also, therefore, in favor of seeing the same distinction at play in Machiavelli's text. Seen from this political theological perspective, Maimonides therefore argues that in Moses' prophecy, of the 5 books of Moses, God reveals himself as having divine attributes which are at the same time political attributes. What this means, to put it very bluntly, is that the only legitimate science or knowledge of God, that is, the only legitimate theology, necessarily takes the form of a political science. With Maimonides, then, one has an example of a political theology, which is not a civil religion, where the authority of the priesthood of the church is not above the authority of the people and their representatives, as happens in the Respublica Cristiana. On this reading, therefore, Maimonides, but similar things can be said also about Al-Farabi and Averroes, makes it possible to unify politics and theology in a way that is entirely different and contrary to the unification proposed by Catholic theological and political thought since Augustine, while also avoiding a crude Latin Averroist idea of religion as a noble fraud. So I think Machiavelli falls in neither of these options. Now, the Jewish-Arabic conception of divine providence differs markedly from the Christian one. As Giorgio Agamben has recently argued, the Christian conception of divine providence is characterized by an economical logic tied to the idea of divine dispensations or mysteries. Christian providence depends on postulating a divine order in which history has a place that is neither the beginning nor the end of the divine calendar of human redemption. Because God, on this picture, has from all times established the calendar of salvation, at whose center stands, of course, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, it follows that nothing can be done to accelerate the return of the Messiah. From an Orthodox Christian standpoint, the Messiah will not return in history, but only once history is at its end. On the basis of this divine economy of salvation, therefore, the Roman Catholic Church is the only legitimate representative of God on earth. So long as the Catholic Church still stands, the end of history has not yet been reached. Now, a few centuries before Machiavelli, there appeared a heretic friar, Joachim of Fiore. And with Fiore, this dispensational conception of Christian providence begins a process of secularization. Many people have spoken about this, which basically means that divine order now happens in history, and it's not a divine order of history, where history has only one place. By unfolding the Trinity into three historical ages, the age of the Father, of the Son, and after 1260, according to Joachim's prophecy, the age of the Holy Spirit. This is important because the age of the Holy Spirit begins with the Franciscans, essentially. That's how the Franciscans thought of themselves. That's why the most radical Franciscans were all Joachim followers. Anyways, with this idea, Joachim of Fiore introduced the idea that God realizes his plan in and through history. For earlier Christians, no historical event could reveal the mystery of God's economy of salvation. But after Joachim of Fiore's claim, basically, that history does reveal God's plan after all, prophets all of a sudden become a real possibility. Prophecy was outruled before Joachim of Fiore. Only makes sense theologically after Joachim. But these new prophets, here's the trick, must remain unarmed, because it is history itself that will bring salvation, namely God's providence that will bring salvation behind the backs of political actors. This was the idea of Savonarola's ideas of providence. The unarmed prophet is merely an interpreter of history, not a maker of history. He or she cannot accelerate the coming of the Messiah. Can I have some water, please? Now, if we look at the alternative Jewish conception of divine providence, or if we read the Bible sensibly, as Warren suggested, we see something entirely different. Namely, we see a God who enters human history as a military leader of his chosen people. Now, the word leader is melech, which means commander. So God is the melech of his people, who leads them in their wars to regain the promised land, which is a land on earth and not supernatural, from other nations. So from the very beginning, God's people is organized as an army whose leader, Melech, in this case Moses, follows the commands of God as Melech. The figure of the armed prophet, Moses, and the figure of the army commander are identical in early Jewish political theology. Now, I won't get into the details of this, but I'm basing this on an 800-page opus written by Martin Buber, which is never translated into English, called God's Kingdom. So, don't ask me for proof. Read the 800 pages in German and you'll see what I mean. Now, this is a particularly crucial point, this point of the identity of the Melech, of the prophet, as an armed leader of a popular army, because this allows me to show where exactly they depart from Martelli, who has a Christian conception of providence. Martelli, in fact, argues that in chapter 26, Machiavelli goes on an excursus on the need for the prince to organize a popular militia whose terzo ordine can withstand the Spanish and Swiss infantry, as Gabriele explained yesterday. And according to Martelli, this means that Machiavelli must have written this part of the chapter earlier, because it expresses, quote-unquote, a republican state of mind in which Machiavelli is still only concerned with stabilizing a city's regime against foreign invaders, but does not yet have in mind the divine redemptive mission to liberate and unify Italy, which he voices in the rest of the chapter 26. Now, this reading of the chapter, according to Martelli, is only plausible if you assume that Machiavelli is referring to a Christian understanding of divine providence. Only on such an understanding can it make sense, as Martelli does, to oppose the order of the Ecclesia Militans, intended to maintain the mystery of the economy of divine providence, to the organization of a people's army strong enough to repel the armies of any monarchy or empire. By separating the parts dedicated to the divinely anointed prince from the parts dedicated to a republican or people's militia in chapter 26, Martelli assumes that God's grace is so powerful, so omnipotent, that it could relieve the divinely anointed commander and his messianic task from the actual burden of organizing and leading into war a people's army in order to accomplish his revolutionary goals. Machiavelli is completely against this. His text does not warrant this reading at all. In fact, he says, quote, God does not want to do all things, so as not to take away our free will or any part of the glory that belongs to us. And the thing that the human being has to do is to reorganize the popular militia. Indeed, Martelli's assumption disregards, the problem with Martelli's assumption is that he has an understanding of divine providence which is false even for Christian providence. Because in all doctrines of providence, whether Christian or Jewish, the fundamental analogy here between God and the things he disposes is that between a general and the army. As Eric Peterson explains in his own treatise on political theology, this analogy of divine providence with the structure of an army originally derives from the image through which Aristotle's and Neo-Aristotelian theology illustrates the proper relation between God and the cosmos. So God is the general and the cosmos is the army. So divine providence from the very beginning is only a discourse which contains an art of war, an art of disposing one's troops, as Gabriele explained last time. The question is to see which disposition of the troop, that is, which conception of divine providence, is the valid one for Machiavelli, and which does he reject? Now, this is the one he rejects. He rejects the Catholic understanding, of course, of divine providence, according to which the Catholic Church has a military order, that's why it's called Ecclesia Militans, composed of priests and lay persons who love first God and then the world, Ordo Amoris, and who therefore form themselves into a military formation of believers, faithful, who are dedicated to preserving the mystery of the economy of divine providence. The Church's conception of itself as an army of saints fighting sin is threatened by, and thus always opposes, the organization of this worldly popular militia. But this is not the case if we switch to a Jewish conception of providence. Here, the ordering of a popular militia does not go against the logic of divine providence, because within Hebrew political theology, God's chosen commander of the people's army, first Moses, then Joshua, is not an absolute sovereign, an absolute king. Rather, the basic postulate of Hebrew political thought is that Moses is the antithesis of any sovereign king. The kingdom, quote-unquote, established through the alliance between God and his people belongs to God, not to Moses, and not to any human being. Thus, the armed prophet, technically, is the person who has the task to make sure that no king will ever rule God's people. Now, one of the fundamental theses of the Prince, as you know very well, is that given the permanent conflict between Popolo and Grandi, chapter 9, a civil prince should always side with the former and proceed to arm them so as not to have to rely on mercenary armies. We talked about this yesterday. Now, when Machiavelli speaks, and this is another famous topos, in Discourses 118, about the need for an absolute commander when corruption is great, who has to comport himself in a manner that is quasi regio, nearly regal, he does not mean to advocate the establishment of a kingdom and the abandonment of the civil principality, as Martelli believes. Instead, Machiavelli is with most probability referring himself to the quote-unquote nearly regal, quasi-regio quality of the Mosaic theocratic regime, according to which Moses cannot become king because God is already in command of an armed people. And for the same reason, Moses cannot permit any monarch to have absolute power over his people. Hence, Moses is a Republican hero, of course, in the tradition. This conjunction of theocracy and popular government, found in the Hebrew Republic prior to the period of the kings, was, of course, already used by Savonarola repeatedly. Here I just cite from Ruth e Mica, 18 maggio 1496. Quote, this is Savonarola speaking, "Your regime, Florence, is similar to that of the judges of the Hebrews, of the Israelites. And I also want to say that this regime and government of the Hebrews, although it was democratic, popolare, because the people held power and the judge did not command but merely counseled the people, it could also be called a kingly government, governo regale." It's incredible. It's right in the same. Because it depended on the mouth of one, that is of God, because God was he who ruled over them, because the mouth of the judge and of the prophet was counseled by God as to what they had to do. Therefore, there is absolutely no tension or contradiction in chapter 26 between Machiavelli's supposedly old Republican view of a militia composed of a people and his supposed new turn towards a figure, a quasi-regia monarchy, as Martelli claims. The figure of the armed prophet, just like the figure of the civil prince who mounts to an absolute status, is in fact completely consequent with this militant Hebrew understanding of republicanism and providentialism. Okay, I had a piece here. Why is this important? Because the conjunction of Jewish, let's say, republican theocracy with a Roman militia, this confluences powerfully, of course, in later Republican history, whether we're talking about Spinoza or... I'm done already. Oh, my God. Okay. Good. Okay, last part there. So I've spoken so far about Moses mainly and explained what the meaning of the armed prophet is. Now, quickly, what's the difference between chapters 6 and 26? I think that in chapter 26, Machiavelli registers, because he read the Bible full well, he registers a crucial change, of course, in the Hebrew Republic, namely with the advent of the kings and the end of Mosaic theocracy. That's why I think that in chapter 26, there is a difference between the figure that he invokes in chapter 26 and the armed prophet of chapter 6. These two are absolutely not the same. Machiavelli does not believe in the return of Moses. That's impossible because human kings are already here. So what we need is a new figure from the Bible, which is not Moses, but stands in tension with Moses. Now, therefore, the new prince that Machiavelli calls upon in chapter 26 must be, properly speaking, not an armed prophet, but a messianic captain of the people. Why? Because the Messiah, on the Jewish conception, is the last king of a people, and this people is itself free and self-organized into the army. The Messiah in this tradition is an extremely paradoxical figure, is the head, the comandante, the capo, of a political body which desires radically not to be dominated. And for this reason, this political body, this armed people, is willing to cut the head off any king or pope or anyone else who represents, or claims to represent, God on earth. And we know that this important idea, this messianic conception, was to have a fruitful life in the English Republican wars. Now, let me just finish with this. And there's a last important, and with this I conclude, a last important Jewish figure that is at play here in the chapter 26. So not only the difference between Moses and the Messiah, which is fundamental, but one last thing. This is the question in Jewish Messianism. There's an important question as to whether human beings can do things, political things, that force the hand of God and accelerate the arrival of the Messiah. We know that Christians cannot do it. Christians cannot force the hand of God to release the Messiah. But in the Jewish conception of providence, there is a long debate whether one can or cannot do that. And Machiavelli sides on the fact that one can do that. That it is possible, human beings can do certain things that force or accelerate the arrival of the Messiah. In other words, there are certain special times, kairos, when it is appropriate to pray for God to send the Messiah. Now, I think that Machiavelli's exhortation in chapter 26 is modeled on precisely this kind of prayer which needs to be pronounced at the right time, in the right kairos. Now, the joke of this is the following. In one of his sermons that's very well known, Savonarola refers to and chastises a famous saying by Cosimo de' Medici, according to which, quote, one does not govern a state by praying, nor by reciting, Our Father who art in heaven. Throughout the Prince, Machiavelli agrees with Cosimo's saying, of course. But now, at the end of his book, he addresses himself to a member of the Medici family in order to ironically subvert Cosimo's sayings. Sometimes, at the right time, the arte dello Stato needs to be messianic. But Machiavelli's messianism is not Savonarola's. Machiavelli's prayer will be fulfilled only on condition that the time is right. And the criterion of rightness, of the occasio, kairos, is whether or not the new prince has in fact enough virtù to have armed his people. That's the question of Cesare Borgia. So in a sense, I agree that the messianic figure is not Cesare Borgia in that sense, at the end. So not only is God unwilling to do everything and therefore awaits the right time to send the Messiah, Machiavelli is saying that the new Medici prince, or the new prince, can force the hand of God by becoming commander of an armed and free people. And in so doing, he will have made himself in the image of God and be deserving of God's grace. Unless the Medici are willing to, therefore, purify themselves of their sins and repent of their previous associations with the Grandi and with the kings of this world, the French kings, in order to embrace the side of the popolo, then they will not live up to the image of God, and as a consequence, God will not grace them with the salvation of their Stato. Thank you.
Miguel, je sais que tu parles toutes les langues du monde, mais tu préfères français ou l'italien?
Ça va, ça va.
Ça va les deux, putain, t'es trop fort. Non, écoute, je voudrais juste rappeler un passage des discours 2.2 qui donne peut-être, enfin, qui à mon avis quand même donne une possibilité d'une autre interprétation, enfin d'une interprétation plus simple. Parce que je dois dire, après, on va lire avec attention voilà, l'ensemble des points que tu nous amènes, l'ensemble des points d'érudition que tu nous amènes, mais il me semble qu'il y a des possibilités de lire dans Machiavel des interprétations plus simples. L'interprétation plus simple de Discours 2.2, c'est qu'en gros... nasce, insomma, è ben che paia che si sia effeminato il mondo e disarmato il cielo, nasce più senza dubbio dalla viltà degli uomini che hanno interpretato la nostra religione secondo l'ozio e non secondo la virtù.
Perfetto.
Perché se si considerassero come la ci permette la esaltazione e la difesa della patria, vedrebbero come la vuole che noi l'amiamo ed onoriamo, eccetera, eccetera.
Perfetto.
E quindi, partendo da questa, forse non c'è bisogno di fare il giro, perché in questo caso è abbastanza semplice, se vuoi. Il Redentore è quello che appunto può riscattare i peccati dei principi. I peccati dei principi sono appunto di non aver avuto le armi proprie, eccetera, eccetera, e quindi rimaniamo all'interno di questa tradizione lì, ossia nel quale di una tradizione che, vabbè, insomma, facciamo quello che possiamo, ma sappiamo che in fondo la provvidenza non ci aiuterà, perché il resto dobbiamo fare noi, come dirà anche dopo nella Mandragola, no? Il resto dovete fare voi, no? Quindi l'essenziale è da fare. No? E l'ultima cosa è che, e questa non è un'interpretazione mia, è quella di Cutinelli Rendi, è un momento un po' specifico quello in cui si scrive il capitolo 26esimo. Il momento è appunto che c'è il Papa Mediceo, eccetera, quindi forse è un momento in cui la Chiesa potrà... eccetera. Quindi non per dire che insomma queste tradizioni qua, forse, e soprattutto l'interpretazione... ecco, del Savonarola, i giudici, il commento di Samuele 8 in Savonarola, eccetera. Tutto questo c'è sicuramente, ma forse... Ecco.
Sono d'accordo, direi che quello che Machiavelli sta dicendo è che tutto questo progetto non può andare avanti se non si ha un concetto forte di cosa vuol dire armare il cielo. E il punto è qui che il concetto cristiano di provvidenza non te lo dà. Nemmeno il repubblicanesimo cristiano alla Viroli ti dà questo. Solo un'altra tradizione, diciamo, che ho chiamato qui ebreo-araba, del concetto di... Ma ci sono due, il punto fondamentale è che ci sono due maniere di capire armare il cielo. Uno è la Repubblica Romana e l'altro è la Repubblica degli Ebrei. Questo è il punto fondamentale. Il problema è se uno dice ma sono i romani armano il cielo, in Roma non c'è un concetto messianico, no, del comandante, e quindi non puoi fare, basandosi sulla religione civile romana è impossibile dare una lettura del tono messianico del capitolo 26, e l'unica possibilità è che dici rhetorical, ironical, eccetera, eccetera, e quindi non è prendere in serio la logica provvidenzialistica del capitolo.
It's fascinating the fact that you try to solve a contradiction looking for other traditions. But is there a contradiction? I mean, the contradiction does exist if you think to just one theological tradition. But at that time there were other traditions. And I'm thinking to conciliarism, the line Occam Marsilius. And there was... probably compatible with this kind of approach, or the use by legal thinkers of theological concepts. I'm thinking to Baldus, degli Ubaldi, and the idea that corporation was also a corpus mysticum.
Yeah.
And so there were already other possibilities. I'm not denying your alternative, but
I agree.
It seems to me that the tradition is not so strict.
Look, Marsilius is crucial, but Marsilius is crucial because he brings precisely an Averroistic conception of what divine law is, the nomoi. Yeah, it's a huge chapter. I'm not talking about Marsilius. Another time I can also give a lecture on Marsilius. It's complicated, but it's not exactly the connection of politics and theology that Machiavelli wants. In part because Marsilio he never gave up the priority, let's say, the higher legitimacy of the church over the secular state, if you wish. I know that he's the father of secularism, but he nonetheless still prioritizes. John is shaking his head. We can talk about Marsilius another time. This is not a conference on Marsilius. But
okay, just very quickly. Now, what I'm going to say is not meant to nullify anything that you've said, because I think you're onto something very, very interesting. But I want to... He's sitting right next to me. Okay, so if we think about a Jewish conception of providence, okay. Now, by far the most important reference, because it's very difficult to find a notion of providence in the Jewish scripture, and the word comes from the act of being a shepherd. It's that idea. And the person who really codifies the concept is Maimonides, okay? But there too, Maimonides is always extraordinarily difficult to figure out exactly what he's doing. But I think it's important to keep in mind that when he codifies the term, it's hashkacha in Hebrew, it's against Epicureanism. He explicitly says that. He has, in fact, it becomes, which is very interesting, it's very new within the Jewish tradition to make providence a defining characteristic of whether you are or not a heretic. And as a matter of fact, in Hebrew, I've said this before, but the word for heretic is apikurus, which is derived from Epicurus. And so it almost seems as if he's doing battle against the threat of Epicureanism by, let's say, fortifying ideas importing Aristotle and a kind of teleological conception that isn't really part of earlier Jewish traditions in one way. But then I think at the same time, because Maimonides is not simply Aristotelian, because as I think you were saying, that there's a Neoplatonic, we could call it that, element, not only in Maimonides, but in the Kabbalistic tradition as well, exactly. With the idea of the Ein Sof, the infinite, and the Sephirot, the emanations. And I think, the question becomes, how do you put together the sort of Aristotelian and Neoplatonic elements? Because in the Kabbalistic conception is not really clear. And maybe Spinoza draws in certain ways from that. It's not really clear that there's a notion of providence or even teleology. I mean, you could push it so that in some way it's much more open than that.
Yeah.
So
okay, my answer to this, I didn't read the paper because I didn't succeed. I skipped the whole part in which I tried to show that Jewish or Arabic conception of providence is actually a naturalism. What Maimonides says, if I understand it, but it gets quite mystical, is that redemption, the end of history, is a return to beginnings. It's a return to creation. Now, in Maimonides, the creation is just a physics, yes, and redemption is a metaphysics, to put it in Aristotelian terms. So, properly understood, if one wants to begin to understand Maimonides, it means that redemption is actually a return to the physics, not a metaphysics. Hence, it is actually possible, not only that, but it's an idea, a Jewish and Arabic idea of providence does not exclude the eternity of the world. And in fact, the eternal return, the Messiah in this tradition, this becomes then the case in Kabbalah, is not someone who arrives